Beneath the delicate calm of Kyoto's imperial palace, a silence breathes that feels older than time itself. The golden roofs shimmer like the surface of still water, reflecting the illusion of peace. But behind those sliding screens of lacquered wood and painted silk once unfolded one of the most secret, most horrifying chapters in Japanese history. Here, within what the chronicles called the hidden court, beauty was a mask and elegance was a weapon. Every ritual, every whispered word, and every fluttering sleeve concealed something: desire, jealousy, vengeance, or shame so deep it had to be erased from history itself. The Heian period, often romanticized as Japan's age of poetry and refinement, was a time when art and cruelty coexisted like two sides of a perfect coin. From the outside, the court appeared as a living dream: women cloaked in 12-layered robes of shimmering color, men gliding through corridors perfumed with incense, and poems exchanged like secret kisses. But what lay beneath this choreography of beauty was a system of control so intricate that even emotions were regulated. The emperor's word was divine law, and yet, those who lived nearest to him were often the most enslaved by the games of power and ritual that ruled the palace. The hidden court was not a single place. It was a state of existence, invisible yet omnipresent. It thrived in shadows behind painted screens and within scrolls that no longer exist. It was the realm of courtiers who could smile while plotting ruin, of women whose survival depended on the subtlety of a glance, and of priests who promised salvation but trafficked in fear. Its horrors were never meant to be written, and yet their faint echoes survive, in cryptic diary entries, in censored temple records, in the rumors that never died. What remains are fragments, but they whisper of a world where faith became submission and beauty became a form of slow destruction. The perfection of Heian court life was not human, it was theatrical. The emperor was considered a living descendant of the sun goddess, a being whose presence sanctified the realm. Yet that divinity came at the cost of his freedom. His every movement was dictated by ceremony. He could not touch the ground barefoot, could not see the common world beyond the palace walls, and could not act as a man, only as a symbol. Around him moved layers of power: the consorts, the regents, the scribes, each with their own secrets, each aware that even a misinterpreted poem could destroy a life. The entire court existed within a dream carefully maintained, a dream that fed upon silence. But silence has a way of becoming unbearable. Behind the paper screens, repressed desires took shape in dangerous ways. Forbidden liaisons, jealousy, and madness festered in corridors where no sunlight reached. There were rules for everything: how to bow, how to write a love note, how to grieve, but no rule could govern the hunger for power or the cruelty of the human heart. Beneath the elegance of calligraphy ink lay stains that history tried to wash away. What happened in those inner chambers was too disturbing to fit into the myth of Japan's golden age, and so, one by one, the records disappeared. Imagine the palace at night. Lanterns flicker like dying stars, the air heavy with the scent of plum blossoms and fear. Somewhere behind a lattice screen, a servant hears a muffled sob, or perhaps laughter. A letter is burned before dawn. A concubine vanishes and her name is struck from the records. In the morning, the courtiers will write poems about the moon and pretend not to notice the empty space where someone used to kneel. That was the true rhythm of the hidden court, a place where erasure itself was an art form, where the most powerful act was not killing but making a life vanish as if it had never been. For centuries, historians would describe the Heian era as Japan's most graceful age, immortalized by literature like the tale of Genji. But even that masterpiece, often called the world's first novel, carries an unsettling undercurrent, a knowledge of women trapped behind veils, of love reduced to strategy, of emotion suffocated beneath etiquette. What the official chronicles recorded in brushstrokes of beauty, the unwritten truth hid in blood and silence. The deeper one looks, the more the boundaries blur between refinement and horror, between devotion and servitude. As centuries passed, much of this truth was deliberately erased. Scrolls that mentioned certain names were burned. Temple archives that once contained confessions and rituals vanished in accidental fires. The imperial scribes, sworn to preserve order, rewrote chaos into harmony. What remained was a version of history cleansed of its pain, its crimes, and its forbidden desires. But the walls remember. The palace stones, the shrines, the buried gardens, they all hold stories too dangerous to be told. To step into this lost world is to confront the paradox of beauty itself. How can something so elegant, so poetic, conceal so much suffering? How could a civilization so devoted to form and ritual be capable of such hidden cruelty? This is not simply a story about Japan, it is a mirror held up to the human soul, to the universal instinct to hide darkness beneath perfection. The hidden court is not just a place in time. It is an idea, a warning, and a reflection of every society that values appearance more than truth. And so, as the camera glides through the mist over Kyoto's ancient roofs, the voice of the narrator lowers, inviting us to listen to the secrets that history tried to bury. Because in this place, behind the silk curtains of the imperial court, the line between sacred and profane was drawn not in ink but in blood. The beauty was real, but so was the horror. And both were worshipped equally. In the heart of Heian Japan, between the 9th and 12th centuries, power was not measured by armies or swords but by words, rituals, and whispers. The empire's center was not a battlefield, it was the imperial court of Kyoto, a world so refined and so detached from reality that even a misplaced syllable in a poem could shift destinies. It was called the Empire of Shadows by later scholars, not for its darkness in the literal sense, but because its true workings were invisible, encoded in layers of etiquette, poetry, and silence. Every glance, every color of a robe, every scent of incense was a political act, a language of power that no outsider could truly understand. The court was a maze of hidden meanings. Every gesture, from the folding of a fan to the tilt of a head, carried significance. Courtiers learned from birth to conceal emotion beneath elegance, to transform jealousy into verse and hatred into charm. In this world, truth was vulgar and silence was survival. The men and women of the palace existed in a kind of theater, each role carefully written by centuries of ritual. The emperor was the sun, his courtiers the orbiting stars, and to shine too brightly was to invite destruction. Behind the flowing robes and calligraphy contests, an invisible war raged. A war of influence, seduction, and annihilation through rumor. It was the Fujiwara clan who mastered this war better than anyone. For generations they controlled the throne not by rebellion but by marriage. By offering their daughters as imperial consorts, they placed themselves at the center of the empire's most sacred institution, the bloodline of the gods. The Fujiwara did not need to wield weapons, they wielded intimacy. In the Heian court, a single woman's pregnancy could determine the fate of the realm. Alliances were sealed not in ink but in flesh, and the walls of the palace became an invisible battlefield where beauty itself was weaponized. To outsiders this world seemed dreamlike. Visitors described the courtiers as creatures of another realm, faces powdered white, teeth blackened as a symbol of refinement, hair cascading like rivers of silk. But the same courtiers who wrote delicate poems about the scent of plum blossoms could order the slow death of a rival with a smile. Assassination rarely came through daggers or poison cups. It came through disgrace. A well-placed rumor whispered behind a folding screen could destroy a reputation overnight. To lose favor at court was a sentence worse than death. It meant exile into silence, erasure from memory, and the slow decay of one's identity. The weapon of choice was language. Letters written in flowing kana script were both declarations of love and coded attacks. A poem might appear to praise the moon, yet secretly mock the recipient's family or status. Courtiers spent hours crafting verses not to express themselves, but to disguise their intentions. The Heian elite turned subtlety into art and cruelty into ritual. Their words could seduce or destroy, but they always glowed with the illusion of grace. The entire system thrived on deception so delicate it appeared divine. Religion, too, was part of this invisible order. The line between spiritual authority and political power was nearly non-existent. Buddhist monks, called into the palace for blessings or exorcisms, became instruments of manipulation. Their prayers could cure or curse depending on who paid them. In the shadows of golden altars, alliances were forged in secrecy, sacred scrolls exchanged for promises of loyalty. What began as faith became a network of influence, a sacred theater that masked greed and fear. The empire's most holy symbols were also its most corrupt. Every evening as twilight fell over Kyoto, the palace came alive with hidden energy. Courtiers moved through the corridors like phantoms, their footsteps silent on tatami floors. Lanterns glowed softly behind silk curtains, turning the rooms into glowing chambers of desire and deceit. Somewhere, a koto played a mournful melody, elsewhere two lovers exchanged letters under the pretense of poetry. The entire city seemed to revolve around those secret communications, around the flow of emotion disguised as art. Power at the Heian court was not something taken, it was something seduced. Yet beneath this intoxicating refinement lurked a deep terror of exposure. To break decorum was to reveal one's humanity, and humanity was weakness. Even the smallest mistake could lead to disgrace that spread through the court like wildfire. Women who laughed too loudly, men who appeared jealous, anyone who displayed uncontrolled emotion risked becoming the subject of ridicule. This psychological pressure created a world where no one could truly breathe, where sincerity itself was a sin. The courtiers became prisoners of their own grace, bound by expectations so rigid that they began to lose their sense of self. The chronicles of the time describe the court as a mirror polished until it forgets what it reflects. It was a society that existed entirely in appearances. Courtiers composed poems about longing and sadness because real emotion was forbidden. They wrote about moonlight because it was safer than writing about truth. The Heian world was one of exquisite suffocation, an empire of silence where art became the only language left for pain. But even perfection decays. Beneath the scent of incense there were hints of rot, servants vanishing, secret punishments carried out in the dead of night, diaries filled with cryptic warnings. The Imaki painted scrolls that depicted court life, show smiles that never touched the eyes, feasts surrounded by unnatural stillness. Those who lived within this paradise of refinement also lived in constant fear, of scandal, of demotion, of the unseen hands that controlled their fates. And through that fear the hidden court took shape, a secret layer beneath the official court, where the rules of survival were rewritten and where morality no longer applied. For the modern eye, the Heian period is remembered through its beauty, the shimmering art, the literature, the perfection of ceremony. But behind that beauty was a machine powered by desire and control. The court's silence was not peace, it was pressure, the unbearable weight of maintaining illusion. Every gesture, every ritual, every love affair was part of a web designed to preserve the fragile order of divinity on earth. The courtiers played their parts so well that even centuries later historians could barely glimpse what truly lay beneath the silk in poetry. What made this world so haunting was not its violence but its quietness. The Heian court did not scream, it whispered. Its crimes were committed not in blood but in ink. Its victims did not die in public squares but vanished softly, like candlelight in the dawn. And yet, those whispers echo through time, faint but persistent, reminding us that even in the most graceful civilizations, darkness finds a way to thrive unseen. The Empire of Shadows was both a masterpiece and a nightmare, a world that proved beauty and cruelty are never far apart, merely separated by the thinnest veil of silence. He was born not as a man but as a symbol, a being whose breath was believed to bridge heaven and earth. In the world of the Heian court, the emperor was no mortal ruler. He was a divine manifestation, the living descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. Yet this sacred identity was a cage of gold, a prison disguised as holiness. Every motion, every word, every moment of his life was governed by ancient protocol so suffocating that his humanity dissolved within it. To be emperor was to exist at the center of the world and yet be forbidden from touching it. The emperor's palace was both sanctuary and cell. Within its walls, no dust was allowed to settle, no unapproved sound could echo. The ruler of the realm walked upon layers of woven silk, separated from the earth as if it were poison. He could not leave the palace without elaborate rituals of purification, could not eat or drink without attendants testing every morsel. His body, the embodiment of divine lineage, belonged not to himself but to the empire. Even his sleep was observed. Ritual attendants sat outside his chamber, listening for disturbances that might signify divine displeasure. From birth until death, his life was dictated by unseen hands. Behind this illusion of divine power stood the Fujiwara regents, who understood that control over a god required control over his world. They crafted the emperor's life as a performance, where he appeared to rule but every decree was written by others. When he spoke it was through scripts. When he blessed it was by instruction. When he took a wife, it was by arrangement that served another man's ambition. His signature sealed laws he would never read, his image sanctified rituals he did not design. He was both revered and irrelevant. His holiness was his weakness. In private, many emperors descended into despair, their isolation so total that they began to question whether they existed beyond the mask of divinity. The diaries of attendants speak of emperors who spent nights whispering prayers to the moon, or staring into mirrors until they could no longer recognize their reflection beneath layers of ceremonial paint. One such account tells of an emperor who refused to speak for weeks, believing his voice had been stolen by the gods. Another reportedly ordered the palace mirrors removed, claiming they showed not his face but that of a dead man. Madness and melancholy were frequent companions of divine isolation. Within the palace, the emperor was surrounded not by family, but by shadows, officials, priests and concubines whose loyalty belonged to the factions that placed them there. His consorts, selected from powerful clans, competed not for affection but for political immortality. To bear an imperial heir meant salvation for one family and annihilation for another. The emperor himself was often little more than a vessel, his desires irrelevant. Even the birth of his children was cloaked in ritual secrecy. He might not see them for months or ever. The palace nursery was guarded like a shrine, and rumors whispered of infants removed, replaced, or erased to secure the bloodline's purity. There were nights when the divine facade cracked. Accounts survive, hidden within court poetry and the secret journals of women, of emperors who sought forbidden comfort in the arms of servants or entertainers, seeking even the faintest taste of human intimacy. These moments of rebellion were fleeting, punished not by public scandal but by quiet disappearance. Servants who crossed the sacred threshold of the emperor's chamber were never seen again. To touch the divine was a sin, and sin required erasure. The emperor learned to bury his desires, to smile through suffocation. Religious ritual became both his stage and his prison. Every day began and ended with ceremonies of purification, where the emperor was washed, clothed, and adorned by others. He was a statue that breathed, a god forced to prove his sanctity through endless repetition. During major festivals, he appeared before his court in layers of embroidered robes so heavy that attendants had to support his arms to help him move. Yet even then he could not look directly at his subjects. His gaze was sacred and therefore forbidden. The emperor was the center of attention and yet never allowed to see the world he ruled. Even illness was treated as divine communication. When the emperor fell sick, priests were summoned not to heal him but to interpret the meaning of his suffering. Rituals were performed to cleanse spiritual impurity, sacrifices made to appease unseen forces. Sometimes the emperor was secluded for weeks in silence, surrounded only by incense smoke and chanting monks. Those periods of withdrawal fed rumors among the courtiers, whispers that the emperor had been possessed, or that he was dead and a double ruled in his place. In a society ruled by appearances, truth became irrelevant. What mattered was the illusion of continuity. The most tragic part of the emperor's existence was his invisibility. He could be heard but rarely seen. Courtiers bowed before silk screens, speaking to his shadow while never daring to meet his eyes. Even his mother or wife might go years without seeing his face. To preserve the aura of divinity, direct contact with the emperor was minimized to the point of absurdity. This isolation served the regents well. It made him untouchable, mysterious, and controllable. The god could not rebel if he did not know he was a prisoner. Yet some emperors did rebel, quietly, dangerously. Emperor Shirakawa, for instance, abdicated the throne but retained power from behind monastic walls, creating the era of cloistered rule. Others turned to mysticism, seeking forbidden rites to reclaim agency. One emperor, according to legend, performed an unrecorded ceremony in the dead of night, offering his blood to ancestral spirits to break the chains of ritual. The following morning he was found in his chambers, pale and trembling, declaring that the gods had laughed at him. He abdicated soon after. Whether this tale is truth or myth, it captures the haunting truth of imperial existence. The divine could not escape its own prison. As centuries passed, the emperor's cage became even more elaborate. The palace expanded into a labyrinth of walls, gardens, and secret corridors designed to protect and conceal. Layers of attendants, concubines, and priests separated him from reality. His image, painted on scrolls, became more symbolic and less human. His eyes distant, his posture unnatural. The physical emperor mattered less than the idea of him, an eternal figurehead whose suffering was erased by ceremony. The court no longer needed him to live as a man, it only needed him to exist as a myth. And so the god-king sat upon his throne, wrapped in silks and shadows, adored yet alone. Outside, Kyoto's seasons changed, the cherry blossoms bloomed and withered, the rivers froze and thawed, but within the palace time stood still. The emperor's laughter was never heard beyond his chambers, his tears never seen. The empire worshipped him as the sun, yet he lived in darkness. His every breath was an act of obedience, his every silence an echo of despair. In the end, his power was nothing but reflection, a fragile illusion sustained by ritual and fear. The emperor's cage was not built of walls but of belief, a prison so perfect that he himself helped maintain it. And in that terrible perfection lies one of Japan's most haunting truths, that divinity, when stripped of humanity, becomes not a blessing but a curse. The gods made flesh do not rule, they suffer. Beyond the emperor's silent corridors lay another world, one hidden even from the eyes of history. It was a labyrinth of screens, gardens, and whispered rivalries known as the Inner Palace, the heart of the Heian court's forbidden beauty and cruelty. Here lived the Niobe, the women of the inner chambers, whose lives shimmered like silk in candlelight and then vanished into silence. They were the empresses, concubines, attendants, and ladies-in-waiting who served at the pleasure of the gods, the court, and the ambitions of powerful men. Their world was lined with perfume and poetry, yet built upon fear, jealousy, and endless competition. The women of the inner palace lived in near total seclusion. They were rarely seen by outsiders and were forbidden to show their faces to most men, even those who desired them. Their chambers were divided by painted screens and sliding doors, creating a world of half-seen silhouettes and disembodied voices. When a courtier or even the emperor himself visited a lady, he might speak to her through layers of curtains, seeing only her shadow, hearing only her laughter. Desire in this world was imagination sharpened by denial. It was beauty made unbearable by distance. But within this delicate architecture of secrecy, cruelty thrived. To be chosen as a consort or lady-in-waiting was both a triumph and a death sentence. The higher one rose, the greater the risk of falling. Rival factions watched every move, every word, every detail of dress or fragrance. The emperor's attention could lift a woman's family to immortality or condemn it to ruin. The Fujiwara clan in particular used their daughters as living pawns in political games, training them from childhood in poetry, etiquette, and seduction. Their beauty was not their own, it was a weapon sharpened for their father's ambitions. Imagine the daily rhythm of their lives. Dawn arrived not with sunlight, but with the soft sweep of attendants brushing incense into their hair. They were dressed in 12-layered robes of color, each hue chosen to express emotion, though emotion itself was forbidden. They learned to bow without moving their eyes, to smile without showing teeth, to write poetry that concealed as much as it revealed. Every movement was performance. Every glance carried danger. A single misstep could mean disgrace, and disgrace meant disappearance. For many women, the emperor's attention was a curse disguised as favor. Once chosen, a consort was bound to the palace forever, forbidden to leave without permission. Her every word and gesture became a matter of politics, scrutinized by rivals and priests alike. If she failed to produce a son, she might be replaced or quietly dismissed to a convent, her name erased from the records. The birth of imperial heirs was shrouded in secrecy. Servants were sworn to silence, and rumors whispered of infants smothered or hidden to protect dynastic purity. Those who defied the hierarchy, who sought affection or agency beyond their assigned roles, simply vanished. The palace did not execute, it erased. Diaries written by women of the court, like the Pillow Book of Sei Shanagon or the Diary of Lady Murasaki, offer fleeting glimpses into this gilded prison. They describe beauty with aching precision, the scent of rain on silk, the moonlight over lacquered floors, yet beneath their poetry lies a current of despair. Lady Murasaki, creator of the tale of Genji, wrote of her disgust for the empty rituals and vanity of court life. She saw how women were praised for their grace while denied freedom, how their intelligence was celebrated only when it served men's desires. Her words tremble with loneliness, a mind trapped inside luxury, aware that her brilliance could never change her fate. The inner palace was a battlefield of femininity. Beneath the layers of silk and ceremony, alliances formed and shattered daily. Servants were bribed to spy, perfumes poisoned to induce miscarriages, letters forged to incite jealousy. Behind every poem sent to the emperor, there was a strategy. Behind every tear shed in his presence, a calculated performance. Women became experts in emotional warfare because open defiance was impossible. They fought with charm, rumor, and silence, weapons as lethal as any blade. Yet the cruelty did not come only from men. The women of the inner palace were both victims and executioners of its system. The older consorts, desperate to maintain their status, often orchestrated the downfall of younger rivals. Friendships were rare and genuine affection was dangerous. Even motherhood offered little safety. Imperial children were often taken away at birth and raised by court-appointed caretakers, turning mothers into strangers to their own offspring. Many women spent their lives loving children they could never touch and serving men they could never see. Punishments for disobedience were never public. They were psychological, ritualized, and absolute. A woman who defied etiquette might be confined to her chambers indefinitely, forbidden to speak, her attendants dismissed. Some were sent to distant temples to repent, in forced seclusion. Others were quietly poisoned, their deaths disguised as illness. The court's greatest cruelty was its discretion. It left no scars that could be seen, no blood to stain the tatami floors, only silence, absence, and memory. The contrast between beauty and suffering was everywhere. Festivals filled the palace with music, blossoms and laughter. Poets recited verses comparing women to flowers, fragile, pure, destined to wither. But behind those verses were real bodies, real women who knew the fragility of their existence. The same cherry blossoms that symbolized love also marked the graves of those forgotten by history. The emperor's affection, like the spring bloom, was brief, and when it passed, so did the women who once held his gaze. Some women attempted to carve meaning from their confinement. They wrote secretly, crafting diaries and love letters that defied erasure. Through ink and brush they preserved their souls when everything else was controlled. These writings are the only voices that survive, faint, trembling, yet immortal. They reveal a haunting truth, that beneath the elegance of Japan's most refined age, women were sacrificed to sustain its illusion. Their suffering was the foundation upon which the empire's beauty stood. In the stillness of night, when the corridors of the inner palace darkened and the last candle died, the sound of weeping sometimes drifted through the walls, soft, rhythmic, almost musical. Servants pretended not to hear. The next morning the courtiers would bow, smile, and write poems about the moon's reflection in water. Nothing had happened. Nothing ever did. The perfection of the court depended on forgetting. The women of the inner palace were not only prisoners of men but prisoners of ideals, purity, grace, obedience, that turned them into ornaments of power. Their world was one of exquisite torture, to be seen but unseen, desired but voiceless, alive but forgotten. And yet their shadows remain. Every poem, every painted screen, every haunting story from the Heian era carries their invisible touch, the fingerprints of those who lived and died behind silk walls, their existence deliberately erased but never entirely silenced. Today tourists walk through Kyoto's reconstructed palaces, marveling at the beauty of the Heian age, the gardens, the art, the serenity. Few realize that behind that beauty once existed a system of cruelty so refined it left no trace. The women of the inner palace lived and vanished without justice, their names replaced by titles, their stories absorbed into myth. But the walls remember. The silence of those rooms is not peace, it is the echo of centuries of repression. Beneath every stroke of calligraphy and every layer of brocade lies a truth too dark for the official chronicles, that the Heian court's perfection was built upon the suffering of women. They were the keepers of its beauty and the victims of its lies, the souls hidden behind the silk, whose pain was woven into the very fabric of Japan's most celebrated age. The world of the Heian court worshipped beauty, but beneath that reverence lay a fear, a terror of impurity that shaped every gesture, every belief, every act of devotion. The courtiers lived in a universe defined by boundaries between sacred and profane, purity and pollution. To be defiled, even symbolically, was to invite spiritual annihilation. But the irony was cruel. The more the court sought purity, the more it created its opposite. Beneath layers of silk and ritualized prayer, forbidden passions simmered. The line between religion and desire dissolved into shadow. And in those shadows, acts occurred that were so unspeakable, they were later erased from history. Ritual purity was the invisible skeleton of Heian society. Every moment of daily life was regulated by complex codes dictating what was clean and what was not. Blood, death, illness, and birth, all were considered sources of defilement. A courtier who encountered death had to withdraw from public life for days, even weeks. Women were secluded during menstruation, forbidden to approach shrines or the emperor himself. Servants burned incense to cleanse the air after childbirth or miscarriage. The obsession was total. The court moved through existence like dancers afraid to touch the ground. Yet purity was never only physical. It was spiritual, psychological, even aesthetic. A man's virtue could be measured by the clarity of his handwriting, a woman's by the refinement of her scent. The more delicate one's composure, the more pure one appeared. This elaborate performance of sanctity concealed a darker truth, that beneath the facade of restraint, the courtier's desires grew distorted. Suppression fed obsession, and the search for purity became a theater of secret transgressions. The priests and monks of the Heian court understood this duality, and exploited it. Buddhism, newly powerful and intertwined with politics, offered rituals to cleanse impurity. Exorcisms, fasting, and water ablutions became common, but so did the abuse of their authority. Monks who were invited to purify noble women sometimes crossed into forbidden acts of spiritual cleansing, through touch and bodily contact. Some sects taught that enlightenment could be reached through the uniting of male and female forces, a justification for rites that blended eroticism and devotion. In private chambers, beneath the flicker of sacred lamps, purity and sin became indistinguishable. There were whispers of monks who entered the palace under the pretense of healing, leaving behind both scandal and silence. A servant's account, later suppressed, described a purification ritual where a woman was stripped and bathed in consecrated water while monks chanted sutras. The ritual was meant to cleanse her soul of spiritual impurity, yet those who witnessed it spoke of trembling, of shame, of something unholy in the supposed sanctity. No records of punishment exist. The priests, protected by their religious status, simply vanished into other temples, their crimes hidden behind incense smoke and prayer. Sex within the Heian court was not only pleasure or reproduction, it was power. To possess another body was to assert dominance over their lineage, their purity, their reputation. Women's chastity was not a moral question but a political one, a measure of her family's honor and the legitimacy of her children. For a court lady, even an accusation of impurity, of being touched by someone unworthy, could mean exile. Virginity was sacred, yet in private, many high-ranking men indulged in sexual excess disguised as spiritual privilege. Priests claimed divine visions to justify forbidden unions. Aristocrats conducted night visits to the chambers of women already vowed to chastity. And always the victims were silenced by the same word, ritual. Behind the illusion of refinement, the palace was a web of erotic tension. Lovers communicated through scented letters, where the choice of ink color or the folds of paper carried coded meanings. The air of the court was saturated with unspoken desire. Poets wrote of longing, of bodies glimpsed behind screens, of sleepless nights filled with guilt. But those same verses, preserved for centuries, were also confessions, veiled accounts of passion that could never be acknowledged openly. The contradiction between purity and desire produced an unbearable tension that found its release in ritual extremes. On certain holy nights, courtiers would gather in candlelit temples to chant sutras against temptation, burning incense until the air grew thick and suffocating. But when the ceremonies ended, some of those same courtiers would slip into the darkness with lovers or prostitutes disguised as priestesses. In a society obsessed with cleansing the soul, sin became another form of ritual, something to be performed, repented, and performed again. One of the most disturbing practices whispered about in later chronicles involved kegar, spiritual pollution believed to spread through contact with the impure. To cleanse themselves, some nobles participated in secret ceremonies of blood and water. These rituals, borrowed from older Shinto traditions, sometimes demanded symbolic sacrifices. Animals were slaughtered, their blood used to anoint the body before washing it away in holy rivers. Some accounts suggest that human blood was occasionally used, though never officially recorded. The idea was to confront impurity by embodying it, to become filth in order to transcend it. Women bore the heaviest burden of this ideology. Their bodies, tied to menstruation and childbirth, were considered inherently impure. The more the court idealized feminine beauty, the more it feared female flesh. Women were kept in isolation during pregnancy and often underwent painful purification after childbirth, long baths in freezing water, prayers recited over them to cool the fire of blood. Some rituals required them to remain motionless for hours, wrapped in damp robes to suppress desire and restore spiritual balance. Those who resisted were branded as dangerous, accused of attracting malevolence or curses. But repression breeds rebellion. Some women of the court, especially those exiled to convents, turned their suffering into defiance. They developed their own secret forms of worship, combining Buddhist and Shinto practices with older, darker traditions. They prayed not to male gods but to vengeful female spirits, invoking the power of the Onryo, ghosts of wronged women. These rituals, carried out in candlelit chambers, terrified the priests. The women who performed them were said to laugh as they chanted, declaring that purity was a lie invented by men to control them. None of their writings survived, but fragments of their prayers appear in later folk tales, echoes of rage turned divine. Meanwhile, official court culture continued to polish its illusions. Paintings depicted the emperor as radiant, the court ladies as ethereal, the priests as serene. Nowhere were the stains of blood or desire shown. The chronicles that survived describe endless ceremonies of refinement, but the spaces between those words, the gaps where entire lives vanished, tell another story. What was recorded as devotion may have been coercion. What was described as purification may have been punishment. The Heian obsession with purity was not about holiness, it was about control. It was the perfect tool for enforcing obedience. By defining impurity as inevitable, the court ensured that everyone was guilty, and that guilt could always be exploited. Priests gained power by offering absolution, noblemen justified cruelty as cleansing. And the women of the court, trapped within this cycle, carried the unbearable weight of being both sacred and damned. In the stillness of the palace night, when the wind passed through the bamboo groves and the sound of distant bells drifted from the temples, there must have been moments when even the most devout courtiers felt the emptiness of their rituals. They had built a world where sin and sanctity had merged, where the search for purity had birthed its opposite. And though the scribes would later erase these contradictions from the chronicles, the truth endures in fragments, in poems too sensual for prayer, in statues whose serene smiles hide the memory of touch, and in the silence that falls after every chant fades. Because beneath the sacred robes and the scent of incense, the Heian court was not holy. It was human, and in its desperate pursuit of purity, it revealed the oldest impurity of all, the hunger that no ritual could cleanse. The Heian court, so often remembered for its refinement, lived in a world where beauty and horror coexisted, where every elegant ritual masked a hidden dread. Nowhere was this more evident than in the secret punishments and purifications of those deemed spiritually corrupted. For the courtiers, punishment was not merely a matter of law, it was a metaphysical necessity. To purge impurity one had to suffer, body and soul. Pain, in its most ritualized form, became a form of cleansing fire. At the heart of this philosophy was the ancient belief that suffering could restore balance between the human and the divine. The courtiers viewed misfortune and pain as signs of karmic debt, spiritual contamination that must be repaid through ordeal. Unlike the punishments of the West, where guilt was measured in crime, here punishment was a sacred transaction. A noble who fell ill, lost favor, or faced public disgrace would often seek purification through tormenting rituals rather than comfort. The higher one's rank, the deeper the need to suffer beautifully. Some of these rites were conducted publicly, grand ceremonies where offenders, often women accused of seducing priests or tainting rituals, were made to kneel in temple courtyards while monks chanted sutras to cleanse their souls. Water from sacred springs would be poured over their heads until they shivered uncontrollably, the cold symbolizing purification. But others, the darker, more forbidden rituals, took place in isolation, under moonlight, or deep within temple precincts closed to ordinary eyes. These secret ceremonies blurred the line between penance and cruelty. The most feared of these rites was known as the misogi of ashes. Those condemned to it were made to sit for days in silence beside smoldering incense burners, the air thick with smoke and heat. The purpose was to burn away the invisible stain of spiritual pollution. Sometimes the incense was mixed with powders of sulfur or herbs that caused hallucinations. Witnesses wrote of participants screaming in terror as visions overtook them, seeing spirits emerge from the haze, their own guilt taking spectral form. Many collapsed before the ritual ended, and their bodies were quietly removed, their deaths written off as divine release. In winter, purification took another form, the ritual of ice. On nights when frost coated the gardens, monks led penitents to frozen rivers, where they were ordered to bathe while reciting prayers. The water cut through flesh like blades, but the belief was that only through extreme pain could the spirit be renewed. Women accused of adultery or improper contact with priests often faced this ordeal. Their screams, swallowed by the cold air, were said to echo through the valleys. No chronicles recorded what happened to them afterward. There were also rituals that combined both extremes, fire and ice, heat and frost, to mirror the cosmic forces of balance. In one account from a lost temple chronicle, a priest described a noble woman who had defied a purification command. As punishment, she was bound in silk soaked with icy water, then brought before an altar surrounded by candles. The heat from the flames steamed against her skin, the silk tightening as it dried. Monks chanted sutras, calling for the demons of lust to depart her soul. When the ceremony ended, her body was cold and motionless. The record ends there, but in the margin, someone had written in red ink, "The fire accepted her." For the court, such acts were not seen as cruelty, they were necessity. Pain was believed to create harmony between the material and the spiritual. To suffer was to be purified, to resist suffering was to defy the divine order. This belief permeated everything from medicine to marriage. A sick person was urged to endure rather than seek comfort, for pain revealed divine favor. Wives were expected to bear childbirth in silence, their agony seen as an offering to the gods. Even mourning had to be done correctly. Too much grief was seen as spiritual weakness, too little as heartless impurity. The emperor himself participated in grand rituals of symbolic purification that bordered on self-inflicted torment. During times of plague or natural disaster, he would fast for days, sleep on straw mats and abstain from speaking, eating, or touching anyone. Some chronicles suggest that emperors even ordered priests to recite prayers while striking their own backs with bamboo rods, a form of spiritual mortification said to absorb the nation's sins. These rites were hidden from the public, performed in inner chambers where only the most trusted attendants were allowed. But as with all systems of sacred suffering, corruption crept in. Some priests began to manipulate these beliefs for power. Those who sought favor from the gods could be persuaded, for a price, to undergo voluntary purification, under a priest's supervision. These often turned into humiliating displays where participants were forced to confess imagined sins while kneeling in freezing water or enduring burns from censers waved too close. Monks who conducted these ceremonies became both feared and revered, their cruelty sanctified by ritual. Women of the court again suffered most under this ideology. Their bodies were seen as the vessels of pollution, and thus they became the preferred subjects of purification rites. A whispered legend speaks of the Temple of Falling Petals, where noble women accused of seducing priests were brought for cleansing. They were stripped, anointed with oils, and made to stand beneath falling cherry blossoms while monks poured boiling water infused with petals over their shoulders. To the onlookers it was poetry, the merging of beauty and agony. But to the women, it was punishment disguised as art. Not all accepted this quietly. In the later Heian years, fragments of hidden diaries reveal growing rebellion among the court's women and even some monks. They began to view these purifications as acts of cruelty, not faith. One entry, believed to be written by a nun exiled for questioning her abbot, reads, "They say fire cleanses. But I have seen only ashes, and the ashes do not pray." Her words were erased from the official record, but copied secretly and preserved in fragments found centuries later. The use of pain as purification reveals the psychological paradox at the heart of the Heian world, that beauty demanded suffering and suffering produced beauty. The court's exquisite art, poetry, and elegance were born from a system that worshipped agony as enlightenment. Every painted screen, every poem about transience and decay, every delicate brushstroke of ink, all were expressions of that shared obsession. To cleanse the soul, one had to destroy the body. To achieve grace, one had to court death. And so, the Heian court lived in a cycle of ritual torment, a society of silken agony. From the outside, they appeared as the epitome of refinement, but beneath that aesthetic perfection lay the truth of their faith, that pain was not punishment but transformation. Fire and ice, beauty and cruelty, all were instruments of the same divine balance. When the last of these purification temples was burned during the civil wars that ended the Heian Age, monks claimed the flames were an offering to the gods. But perhaps in that final act of destruction, the court's obsession was purged at last, its beauty consumed by the same fire that once promised salvation. In the hidden chambers of Kyoto's sacred temples, where incense burned without ceasing and the air trembled with whispered prayers, the Heian courtiers looked not to human laws for moral order, but to their gods. And in those gods, they saw reflections of their own desires, fears, and cruelty. The deities of Japan's old religion were not merciful beings. They were unpredictable, capricious, and often cruel. The Buddhist and Shinto pantheons that coexisted in the Heian court created a world where the divine did not comfort the suffering. It demanded suffering as proof of devotion. Pain was not only a consequence of life, it was its meaning. The priests who served in the imperial temples spoke often of karmic balance. To live was to pay a debt, to suffer was to ascend. In the sermons recited before nobles and courtiers, monks declared that even the gods endured torment in pursuit of enlightenment. The tales of Buddha's trials, his hunger, his pain, his sacrifice, became the model for human purification. Yet as these beliefs intertwined with the native Shinto worship of spirits, they evolved into something darker, something distinctly Heian. Suffering was no longer only a path to salvation. It became a divine imitation, a way to mirror the gods themselves. In this syncretic religion of pain, every deity had a lesson. The Shinto god Susanoo, the Stormbringer, was worshipped for his chaos and rage, Amaterasu, the sun goddess, for her withdrawal and isolation. Their myths reflected the emotional extremes of the court, indulgence followed by withdrawal, ecstasy followed by silence. But among the most feared and revered figures was Fudo Mayu, the immovable king. His image appeared in temples throughout Kyoto, a furious figure with flaming hair, holding a sword in one hand and a rope in the other. The sword cut through delusion, the rope bound demons and sinners. Monks prayed to him not for mercy but for endurance. His fire symbolized purification through agony. Courtiers seeking redemption would sometimes kneel before his image for days, staring into its painted flames until they wept or collapsed. Some monks carried the devotion further, performing Goma fire rituals, burning offerings and even inflicting small burns on themselves as acts of spiritual imitation. These flames, they believed, consumed impurity. A noble who had fallen into scandal might sponsor such a ceremony, offering incense, gold, or even locks of hair to be burned before Fudo's altar. The symbolism was unmistakable: sacrifice of the body to save the soul. The court poets turned these divine images into metaphors of desire and despair. They wrote of gods who suffered for love, of spirits who lingered in anguish, of beauty that burned itself to nothing. Their verses blurred theology and sensuality. The flame of enlightenment became the flame of passion. Divine purification became erotic annihilation. The human and the divine were intertwined through suffering. The influence of Buddhism brought another layer of psychological complexity, the notion of impermanence, mujo. Everything they believed was fleeting. Love, power, beauty, all dissolved like smoke. But this understanding did not bring peace, it brought obsession. If nothing lasted, then the only way to make meaning was through intensity, to feel pain, to burn brightly before disappearing. Many rituals of the Heian court reflected this belief. The suffering of purification became a reminder of mortality, and in that awareness they found a strange ecstasy. One of the most haunting stories preserved in temple manuscripts tells of a monk named Kun, who became obsessed with experiencing divine suffering. Believing that enlightenment required the destruction of the body, he began a series of self-mortifications. He fasted for months, meditated in freezing rivers, and eventually burned his skin with incense. His final act, described in trembling script by an anonymous witness, was to seal himself inside a small wooden cell, chanting sutras as it was walled shut. When the cell was reopened years later, only ashes and a perfect lotus flower remained on the floor. The monks called it a miracle, but others whispered that he had gone mad, consumed by the god he tried to imitate. This story spread through the court, both terrifying and inspiring. The image of a man willingly burning himself for the gods fascinated the aristocracy. Some courtiers commissioned scrolls depicting scenes of sacred suffering. Monks in flames, saints pierced by needles of devotion, bodies dissolving into smoke. These artworks were displayed in private chambers, admired not for horror but for beauty. The Heian elite had transformed divine agony into an aesthetic ideal. Among the women of the court, devotion often took quieter but no less extreme forms. Some secluded themselves in temple annexes, fasting until their bodies grew frail, convinced that their pain would atone for spiritual impurity. Others performed kugatachi, a ritual of standing beneath icy waterfalls while reciting sutras. Their devotion was often praised by priests but quietly exploited. The boundary between piety and abuse vanished beneath the sound of flowing water and whispered prayers. Over time, the line between religious discipline and sadistic fascination grew blurred. Monks and nobles alike began to see physical suffering as both divine and erotic. Paintings from the late Heian era depict deities bound in ropes or pierced by flames, their faces serene in pain. These were not crude images of torture, they were icons of transcendence. The gods did not scream, they glowed. This aesthetic, of serenity through agony, would shape Japanese spirituality and art for centuries. In secret sects of esoteric Buddhism, known as Mikyo, this idea reached its most forbidden form. Practitioners sought enlightenment through ritual union, the merging of opposites, male and female, pain and pleasure, death and ecstasy. Within the walls of certain temples, these rites were enacted in whispers, their details hidden from official record. Some claimed that through this merging, participants became one with the divine. Others called it blasphemy. But the fact that such practices existed, even rumored, reveals how deeply the Heian court had entwined devotion with desire. To suffer was to imitate the gods. To inflict suffering was to act on their behalf. The emperor, viewed as the divine descendant of the sun goddess, was seen as the earthly mirror of this cosmic balance. His court's rituals, the fasts, the prayers, the self-denials, were acts meant to keep the world in order. Every act of purification, every punishment disguised as prayer, was an offering to the unseen forces that ruled heaven and earth. Yet this theology of pain carried a hidden cost. The more the court glorified divine suffering, the more it dehumanized those who suffered. The gods were imagined as beings who transcended agony, humans, however, were destroyed by it. The monks who burned themselves, the women who froze beneath waterfalls, the nobles who starved for redemption, all became sacrifices to an idea that mistook torment for truth. In the twilight years of the Heian era, as war and famine began to consume the empire, the court's faith in divine endurance only deepened. Monks preached that the disasters were signs of collective impurity, punishments from the gods for moral decay. Purification rituals multiplied. Fires burned through temples night after night, smoke rising to the heavens as if carrying the souls of the penitent. The gods of pain had become insatiable, and the people, trapped in their worship, kept feeding them. When the capital finally descended into chaos, with temples looted and palaces abandoned, some chroniclers claimed that the idols of feudal Maya wept, not from pity but from joy. The flames consuming Kyoto were, in their eyes, the final purification of a world that had mistaken beauty for virtue and suffering for salvation. The legacy of these gods endured long after the Heian court turned to ash. Their images still gaze from temple walls, calm amid fire, unblinking amid torment, reminders of a time when the divine was not gentle, and when humanity sought transcendence not through peace but through pain. By the late Heian era, the court's elegance had begun to rot from within. The rituals that once bound the empire together had become hollow performances, beautiful on the surface but empty beneath. The courtiers still wrote their poems and held moon-viewing feasts, yet every gesture hid suspicion. The emperor's divinity, once unquestioned, now felt like a fragile illusion sustained only by silence. And in that silence, cruelty was allowed to bloom like a poisonous flower. Those who dared to speak truth were erased. Records were rewritten, names removed, and scandals disguised as divine punishment. The courtiers had perfected a different kind of violence, the violence of omission. It was no longer the blade or the rope that destroyed a life, but the deliberate act of making it vanish from memory. To be forgotten was worse than death. This was the ultimate cruelty of the hidden court, annihilation through silence. The priests too became instruments of this system. Once protectors of the sacred, they turned into guardians of control. Confession was twisted into surveillance. Purity became a weapon. Behind temple doors, rituals were used to break the will of those who strayed. Women forced into monastic seclusion, servants branded with invisible shame. These acts were called purifications, but they were punishments designed to remind the powerless that even their souls belonged to the emperor's order. By the end, the court's obsession with purity consumed itself. When truth became unbearable, lies took its place. When devotion became hollow, fear filled the void. The beauty that once defined the Heian world had become its poison, a mirror reflecting its own decay. And when the final flames rose, temples burning, archives destroyed, it was as if Japan itself wished to forget the face of its own gods. When the Heian court finally fell into silence, what remained was not ruin but reflection. The palaces crumbled, the rituals faded, yet the spirit of that hidden world endured, a ghost stitched into Japan's soul. Its beauty had been flawless, but that perfection came at a cost too great to name. The courtiers believed they could turn pain into art, submission into sanctity, and desire into devotion. But in their pursuit of divine order, they lost the most human part of themselves. Today, the legacy of that age lingers not in records or relics, but in the quiet tension between grace and sorrow that defines Japanese culture. Every tea ceremony, every poem about the fleeting cherry blossom, carries a whisper from the Heian shadows, a reminder that beauty is never innocent. What was erased from the chronicles still breathes in the spaces between words, in the silence that beauty demands. The Heian court may be gone, but its truth remains. When a society worships perfection, it inevitably sacrifices mercy. And somewhere, beneath Kyoto's calm skies, the ghosts of that forgotten empire still drift, forever searching for purity in the ruins of their own creation.